I helped build this company for 6 years, my wife declared to the crowded Vancouver courtroom, her tone calm and carefully practiced. I'm entitled to half of everything, including the $3.8 million from your father's timber rights. That money now belongs to both of us. Judge Morrison briefly reviewed the thick stack of paperwork her attorney had submitted, detailing the strategy to claim half of my family's logging business. My wife sat confidently in her expensive cashmere coat, the same one she'd charged to my account last Christmas, looking like someone already convinced of victory. What she didn't realize was that my father, William Bennett, had spent the final year of his life planning for this exact scenario. My name is Harold Bennett. I'm 63 years old, and I manage Bennett Timber Operations based in Prince George, British Columbia. For 4 generations, my family has worked these forests, beginning in 1891 when my great-grandfather arrived from Scotland with little more than an axe and determination. By the time I met my second wife at a forestry conference in Whistler 7 years ago, our company was harvesting more than 200,000 cubic meters of timber each year and employing nearly 80 people across 3 camps. She was working as an environmental consultant then, advising logging firms on sustainable practices. She was intelligent, engaging, and clearly passionate about the industry. She appeared genuinely interested in how 4 generations of Bennett men had balanced profitability with conservation. When she moved into my home outside Prince George after 8 months of dating, she blended into my life as if she'd always been part of it. She supported me through my father's declining health, accompanied him to dialysis appointments, and read to him when his eyesight began to fail. She cried at his funeral 18 months ago and promised to help me preserve his legacy. I truly believed I had found a lifelong partner. I was mistaken. The warning signs were subtle at first. After my father passed and I inherited his personal estate, including $3.8 million in timber rights accumulated over 60 years, my wife's behavior changed almost immediately. Suddenly, she insisted the house needed costly renovations. New furniture became a necessity. She demanded a luxury SUV, claiming my truck embarrassed her as a company owner's wife. Weekend trips to Vancouver turned into monthly expectations. When I raised concerns about expenses, she became defensive. "I gave up my consulting career to support your business, Harold," she'd say. "This is what successful couples do." Before our wedding, my father had insisted on a prenuptial agreement. "This isn't about love," he told me in his calm, deliberate way. "It's about protecting what 4 generations built for the 5th. The forests don't care about emotions, and neither should your legal documents." My wife resisted, calling the idea outdated and offensive. Eventually, she agreed, claiming she hadn't read the details because she trusted me completely. What she didn't know, what only my father's lawyer, Douglas Chin, and I understood, was the special clause my father had quietly included in his will. The inheritance wasn't fully mine yet. According to his terms, I could access the full $3.8 million only after 5 years of a demonstrably stable marriage. However, there was a trigger clause. If my spouse ever filed for divorce and demanded a share of the inheritance itself, the funds would immediately transfer to me as permanent separate property. My father referred to it as his character test. Sitting in that courtroom, listening as my wife's attorney argued why she deserved millions she hadn't earned, I felt my father's presence. His foresight was about to deliver a lesson that would prove extremely costly. Let me go back and explain how I met the woman who tried to take my family's legacy. It was September 2019 at the BC Forestry Association conference in Whistler. I was speaking on selective harvesting methods when a confident woman approached me during lunch. She wore a professional blazer, offered a firm handshake, and demonstrated real knowledge of timber management, rare among environmental consultants who often viewed loggers as adversaries. "Catherine Marsh," she said, "I work with Pacific Environmental Solutions. I believe logging and conservation can coexist." We talked for 3 hours. She asked thoughtful questions about our selective harvesting practices and seemed impressed by my family's long-standing commitment to the land. When I mentioned that our company began with just a handsaw and a single horse, she looked genuinely moved. "That's real success," she said, "building something that lasts generations." At 63, after losing my first wife, Margaret, to cancer 5 years earlier, I'd accepted that companionship might no longer be part of my future. Catherine felt like an unexpected gift. She moved to Prince George 2 months later, saying her firm was expanding inland. In hindsight, the timing was convenient. We dated for 8 months before she suggested moving in. She was caring and supportive, making my quiet house feel like a home again. When my father's kidney disease worsened in early 2020, Catherine stepped up. She drove him to dialysis when I couldn't leave the camps, stayed with him during treatments, and brought homemade soup when he was too weak to eat. At his funeral, she held me and promised to help me preserve his legacy. "He raised a good man," she whispered. "I'll spend my life proving I deserve the Bennett name." I proposed 6 months later. My father was still alive then, though his health was failing. When I told him my plans, his expression grew serious. "Get a prenup," he said. I argued that Catherine wasn't that kind of person. He disagreed. "This isn't about her character. It's about protecting future generations." When I raised the subject with Catherine, her reaction was sharp. "After everything I've done for you and your father, you want me to sign something that says I'm a gold digger?" The argument lasted 4 days. She threatened to cancel the engagement twice. Ultimately, she agreed, only because my father made it clear there would be no wedding without it. She signed without reading past the first page. The wedding was modest, a small ceremony at the Prince George Golf and Curling Club, followed by a reception for close family and friends. Catherine looked radiant and played the role perfectly. During her vows, she promised to protect the Bennett legacy. My father pulled me aside at the reception. He told me quietly, "I updated my will last week. Douglas has the details. Just trust the process."
My father passed in March 2023, 18 months after our wedding. Kidney failure finally ended the battle he'd fought for nearly a decade. His last words to me were, "Trust Douglas. Follow the plan." The funeral was harder than I expected. Catherine managed the arrangements and ensured my father received the farewell he deserved. A week later, Douglas Chen called us in for the will reading. He explained the inheritance and the conditions attached. When he mentioned the 5-year marriage requirement and the trigger clause, Catherine listened carefully. At the time, I didn't grasp the importance. She nodded as if it were all reasonable. The changes began soon after. Catherine started asking detailed questions about company finances. Her spending increased steadily. Luxury groceries, weekly spa visits, and exclusive fitness club membership. When I mentioned costs, she reminded me of the inheritance. "We'll be millionaires in 5 years," she said. "I'm just aligning our lifestyle with our future." Then came the major purchases, a $20,000 diamond bracelet, a luxury vehicle, a complete kitchen renovation. By our 2nd anniversary, she'd accumulated nearly $9,000 in charges in a single month. When I suggested slowing down, she reacted angrily. "I gave up my career for you," she said. "The least you can do is trust me." Something in her tone unsettled me. The final piece of this situation involved our neighbor, Martin Sawyer, a divorced mill operator who owned the adjacent 100-acre property. Years earlier, his mill had lost a major contract to another processor after failing quality standards. The loss ruined his business and marriage. He blamed the Bennett family and carried that resentment for years. When he bought the neighboring land in 2020, I thought it was coincidence. Looking back, I understand it was anything but. I made a clear effort to be a good neighbor. Martin played his part convincingly, the grateful man who had learned from past mistakes, a divorced neighbor simply trying to rebuild his life. He stopped by from time to ask for advice on logging road upkeep, always polite and appreciative of any guidance. But Martin Sawyer was thinking far ahead. He was observing our routines, studying Catherine closely, especially after news of my father's inheritance. He noticed her growing interest in money, her rising spending, her taste for luxury, and the way she spoke about finances when she believed no one was listening. Martin saw something in Catherine that I failed to recognize, the same calculated ambition that had poisoned his own marriage, but more refined and far more patient. He realized she could be the ideal tool for his long-held resentment toward the Bennett family. Their first real interaction happened about 8 months ago. Catherine was walking near the edge of our property when Martin approached with a bottle of wine and a sympathetic tone. He mentioned that she seemed stressed and casually referenced how difficult divorce could be. Catherine quickly corrected him, insisting we weren't divorcing and that we were happy. Martin backed off smoothly, then shifted the conversation, noting how marriages can become complicated when significant money is involved, and how he had learned that lesson personally. From that point on, Martin carefully nurtured the connection. They had casual conversations along the property line about unappreciative husbands, stories from his own divorce, and discussions framed around financial independence and women's rights within marriage. Catherine didn't just listen, she welcomed the validation of thoughts she'd never shared with me. Martin offered empathy and, more importantly, practical advice from someone experienced in a high-stakes divorce. In May, he told her the key was documentation, understanding assets, knowing her rights, and applying the right strategy. He recommended her former divorce lawyer, Amanda Price, and introduced her to the forensic accountant from his case, Robert Fielding. He explained methods for collecting financial records and strengthening a claim for the largest possible settlement. Martin wasn't simply advising Catherine, he was deliberately positioning her to cause maximum damage to my family. All the while, I remained unaware. Martin continued acting like a friendly neighbor, waving, borrowing equipment, even expressing concern that Catherine seemed distant. "Marriage is tough," he'd say with rehearsed sympathy. I had no idea he was quietly undermining my marriage, using my wife's own ambition as leverage. The truth came out by accident. One Thursday afternoon in June, I returned home early from a camp in McBride due to equipment trouble. I expected Catherine to be at her book club, but instead I heard voices in the kitchen. Catherine was speaking about weaknesses in the prenup and arguing that her domestic support could be tied to business growth. I recognized Martin's voice immediately as he recommended Amanda Price and explained legal strategies. When Catherine asked about the inheritance, Martin said it was more complex, but that Robert Fielding knew how to uncover hidden assets and was worth every dollar of his $12,000 fee. I quietly stepped back outside and sat in my truck for nearly 20 minutes, trying to absorb what I had heard. The woman I trusted was planning my financial ruin with my neighbor. That evening, I confronted her. At first, she denied everything, then quickly shifted tactics. She claimed fear of me, of how I'd changed since my father's death. She accused me of being controlling and said she only wanted to understand her rights. It was a calculated reversal, turning my discovery into my supposed failure. Her performance was convincing, almost enough to sway me. 3 weeks later, I became seriously ill with a severe flu. Catherine reverted to the caring wife I thought I knew, bringing soup, monitoring my temperature, sleeping elsewhere so I could rest. She spoke softly about our future and even donated some of her designer clothes, saying she'd become too focused on material things. As I recovered, doubt crept in. I questioned whether I'd misjudged her and whether Martin had influenced her unfairly. I even began to see my father's legal safeguards as excessive. I met Douglas Chen for coffee and told him I was considering modifying the will conditions. Douglas listened carefully, then reminded me that my father's intentions went beyond protecting money. He explained that my father had anticipated this moment, knowing I might struggle between evidence and emotion. He handed me a USB drive my father recorded shortly before his death. That night, I watched the video alone. My father explained that he never trusted Catherine, not out of malice, but because she viewed our family's success as an opportunity rather than a responsibility. He admitted hiring a private investigator months into our relationship.
The findings showed a clear pattern: previous relationships with wealthy men, each ending after financial benefit was secured. She had targeted me deliberately. My father concluded by saying that if Catherine truly loved me, she'd wait 5 years without complaint. If not, her actions would reveal her intentions. 2 weeks later, she proved him right. I came home to find her packing. She told me the marriage wasn't working and that she wanted an equal partner, not someone bound by conditions. She informed me she'd hired Amanda Price and planned to claim half of everything, including the inheritance. She recited legal arguments with practiced precision, clearly coached. She announced she'd file for divorce the next day.
What Catherine didn't realize was that by demanding a share of the inheritance, she had triggered my father's clause. The divorce filing gave me immediate, sole access to the full $3.8 million. Douglas confirmed it the same day and asked me to come in to prepare. At his office, Douglas explained that Catherine's case relied on arguing spousal contribution to asset growth. But her own forensic accountant, Robert Fielding, had undermined that claim. His report showed the business had declined during our marriage and that Catherine's support had not contributed to its value. The evidence she paid for destroyed her argument. There was one more mistake. Martin's involvement connected her legal team to his own past case, which was public record. That connection would soon unravel everything she thought she had carefully planned. I reviewed the files yesterday. Douglas slid another folder across the table. Martin's 2016 divorce revealed a clear pattern of deception, hidden assets, financial manipulation, and behavior that ultimately collapsed in on him. He lost everything because his greed pushed him too far. He tried to conceal assets from his ex-wife, was found in contempt of court, and paid a heavy price. Now, he was guiding Catherine toward the very same mistakes. Amanda Price was using strategies identical to those that had already failed in Martin's case. At that point, the situation became clear. Catherine had surrounded herself with advisors whose prior case had ended disastrously, and she had hired a forensic accountant who unintentionally proved she had no valid claim to my inheritance. "So what's our approach?" I asked. Douglas leaned back calmly. "We give Catherine exactly what she asked for, a full legal proceeding. Everything goes on the record: the prenup, your father's will, Fielding's forensic report, Martin's involvement, Catherine's spending habits, every detail." Over the following week, Douglas built the case with precision. He subpoenaed Catherine's financial records, which revealed nearly $90,000 in personal credit card debt. He documented her consultations with multiple divorce attorneys, establishing clear premeditation. He even obtained text messages between Catherine and Martin discussing legal strategy. The foundation of her claim, Douglas explained, relied on proving two things. First, that her domestic support contributed to business growth during the marriage, and second, that the inheritance should be treated as marital property despite explicit exclusions in the prenuptial agreement. "She can't prove either," Douglas said. "In fact, her own evidence disproves both." Fielding's report showed the business had declined during the marriage, directly contradicting any argument that Catherine's support increased its value. And by formally demanding a share of the inheritance in divorce proceedings, she had triggered my father's clause, making the inheritance permanently separate property. Douglas then produced one final document. "Your father left a letter to be read in court if this ever happened. Would you like to see it first?" The letter was 2 pages long, written in my father's careful handwriting and addressed to any court reviewing my divorce. He explained that the inheritance conditions were designed to distinguish between a spouse who truly loved his son and one who viewed him as a financial opportunity. Any spouse who genuinely cared for Harold's well-being would never risk his financial security by demanding a share of an inheritance meant to protect a family legacy. Making such a demand, he wrote, revealed character and automatically disqualified the claimant from any benefit. The inheritance, earned through 4 generations of work, was meant to protect future generations. I looked up at Douglas. He thought of everything. Your father spent 60 years dealing with people who wanted what he built without earning it. Catherine never had a chance. The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. Catherine's legal team requested an expedited process, confident in their position and unaware they were stepping into a plan decades in the making. Monday morning was cold and gray, typical for November in Vancouver. I sat in the courthouse parking lot briefly, watching Catherine arrive with her lawyers. She wore the same cashmere coat and carried herself with complete confidence. Martin Sawyer sat in the back row of the courtroom, nodding at me as if we were still friendly neighbors. Judge Morrison called the court to order promptly at 9. Known for efficiency and little tolerance for theatrics, she listened as Amanda Price delivered her opening statement. Price presented the case as straightforward. Catherine had sacrificed her career, provided domestic support, and contributed to the preservation and growth of marital assets, including inherited property. Catherine nodded along, playing her part convincingly. Price requested $1.9 million from the inheritance, plus half of all other marital assets and spousal support. Douglas rose next, carrying only a thin folder. He stated calmly that while the petitioner had submitted extensive evidence, that same evidence demonstrated she had no legal claim to the inheritance. He presented the prenuptial agreement explicitly excluding inherited assets, followed by William Bennett's will with his specific conditions. Judge Morrison paused as she reviewed the documents. By filing for divorce and demanding a share of the inheritance, Douglas explained, Mrs. Bennett triggered the clause that immediately transfers all inherited property to my client as separate assets. The reaction was immediate. Catherine's expression drained of color. Price flipped through her papers, clearly unsettled. Douglas continued, submitting Fielding's forensic report. The judge read it carefully. The conclusion was clear. The business declined during the marriage, and there was no evidence that spousal support increased its value. Judge Morrison removed her glasses and addressed Catherine directly. She summarized Catherine's actions, hiring a forensic accountant, consulting multiple lawyers, and demanding an inheritance she agreed was excluded. Catherine attempted to respond, but the judge stopped her. The will, she explained, was designed to test exactly this behavior. When Price attempted to challenge the prenup and will on unconscionable grounds, the judge rejected the argument. Catherine had legal representation when she signed the agreement, and the inheritance conditions were within the deceased's rights. Douglas then submitted my father's letter. Judge Morrison read it silently, then announced her ruling. The prenuptial agreement was valid and enforceable. Catherine had no claim to the inheritance or excluded assets. She was entitled only to half of marital assets acquired during the marriage, offset by her personal debt. The result was decisive. Catherine walked away owing $59,000. The court adjourned. Catherine remained seated as the room emptied. Martin slipped out quietly. Douglas gathered his papers and told me simply, "Your father would be proud."
That evening, I sat in my father's old chair, looking out over the forests he loved. The inheritance was officially mine, $3.8 million to secure the company's future. But more valuable than the money was the lesson. Catherine texted that she intended to appeal. Douglas laughed when I showed him. She never did. Within 8 months, she declared bankruptcy and left British Columbia. Martin sold his property and disappeared from the industry. I invested the inheritance into modernizing operations and sustainable technology. The company grew stronger. I also funded estate planning education for small business owners, believing my father's wisdom should be shared. 3 years later, Bennett Timber operates across 3 provinces, and the inheritance has grown significantly. The real value was never the money. It was understanding human nature. I keep my father's letter framed beside a photo of our first logging truck. His lesson endures. Protect what you build, plan carefully, trust wisely, and let greed defeat itself.